All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Greetings and thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. We appreciate it. My name is Andy Lanoux. I'm the brand manager for Ralco Show, and we're thrilled to be able to get everyone together tonight to talk about show pigs. So although the current situation's really put a damper on what we believe it's still a great chance to take some time to talk about pigs and to do some learning. So today we're thrilled to bring Ralco Joe Snedden together with Dr. Russell Fent to really give us a chance to talk about show pigs and learn a little bit about Ralco, about some of our approaches, what's important to show feeds, and what we can do there. So we're thrilled to have both of these two kind of leading our Ralco show team. Both of them have an abundance of knowledge in the show ring and experience in the show ring. And if you've had the opportunity to be supported by one of these two, I've heard nothing but good things from our customer base out in the country. So that's great. So during the webinar, certainly feel free to look at the Q&A section to go ahead and submit questions. We're going to work and do our best to address as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. We're going to kind of work through our content and then catch questions at the end. So certainly feel free to go ahead and do that. So this is our Journey to the Ring webinar series. Will continue the next 3 weeks as well. We've got some additional content that we'll be going through there. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. And we appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight.
Thanks, Andy. To get things kicked off here, we're going to start with our agenda here for the first webinar of this 3-part series that we're going to offer. The first webinar here that we're going to offer here is why show feeds matter. Here tonight, we're going to talk about our agenda. The current show environment will be one of our first subjects that we cover. But we'll also talk about Ralco. That's getting to know Ralco, the mother company. And then also we're going to talk about why Ralco Show, why Ralco decided to invest in Ralco Show. And then Dr. Fent will also talk about show pigs versus commercial pigs and also evaluating show feeds. So to get into our first item on the agenda, we're going to talk about the current show environment. So we all know with the current situation that we're all facing right now, it's not ideal for sure. But we all know that our barns are full, empty show rings. We don't have that opportunity to go to show rings. We hope that opens up here in the near future. But as of right now, that's the current situation that we're dealing with right now. One thing that we can look at and some positives or a silver lining out of all of this is we don't want to miss out on the opportunity and the experience that is in front of us here. And when we talk about that, it's a great time for us at Ralco Show and for the livestock industry altogether. It's a great time to learn, come up with some new ideas and some new things and experiment in some ways with these animals. You may be at home or you may have went to a show in the past and wondered, how did those kids or those families get those animals to that point, get them to that area or that look that we're not getting to. So this is a good time to experiment and try to do some new things and try to make yourself better and get those animals to a different place there that you don't normally run into. It's also a great time to enjoy the slower pace. So things have slowed down here. It's not as hectic. It's a little easier pace and a lot better time for everybody. We can also reflect and refocus. And so when we talk about reflecting, that's looking back at our past experiences and you can look at your failures, but you can also look at where you were successful and use both of those to help you to improve and to become a better stockman or a better feeder or a better shower, and like I said, a better stockman altogether. And it's also a great time to refocus. We can recharge those batteries and look back there and like we said, reflect and refocus there on our projects and plan for the future. And it's a great time to get to know Ralco Show there in the process as well. So with that being said, we're going to let Dr. Russell Fent talk about Ralco and getting to know Ralco.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, before we get into some of the content, just wanted to give just some real brief comments here, just so if you're not familiar 100% with Ralco, you understand a little bit of the where we're coming from in terms of the parent company, and then we'll roll into our content here. So, really, Ralco is a company on the more on a global scale. If we look at the highlights of that, we're involved with multiple species. You see this is pulled off of our parent company website, but you see we're in swine, and predominantly a large part of our business on the animal side is swine. We also do some beef and dairy, and actually poultry and aquaculture and agronomy as well. And so what's interesting about Ralco is it's a family-owned company. It's a third generation family that it still owns that. It's still within the family. Really interesting story about the guy that started the company. Bob Galbraith actually started the company in 1971, and he started in his garage. And so it was a really, really cool story to learn the history of that. But what I really enjoy is the culture of the company, that it's maintained those family values and that throughout the time. And then you'll notice that across all brands, you'll notice that we have something that we focus on called rethinking nutrient conversion. And so that's kind of a high level, but that goes across all of our species that we look at. Okay. And then also one thing that Ralco does a lot is developing our own proprietary technologies. There's a lot of research and technology and development that's done within Ralco over the years. And you'll see a few of those across the bottom there, one being essential oils and plant extracts. That essential oil term is something that's become more common on the human side of things in recent years. But what's interesting, you may not know, Ralco's been doing research on the animal side with essential oils for about 20 years. And so they were well ahead of the curve in terms of there wasn't much research on that. And so they had to develop a lot of that early on. And that's something that they've continued, and we've continued to grow in as we've gone. Another area of technology that we focus in on is the energy maximizing diets, and that's across species, and also microbial processes. And so that can involve gut microflora populations in the animal, and how that affects gut health and those types of things as well. So those gives you a little bit of idea on that. Okay. And then one of the things that really drives our innovation at Ralco is research. So Ralco, we really focus on continuous improvement. We've got a team of nutritionists, PhD and master's levels nutritionists that really strive to improving our technologies. And part of that comes from our research facilities that we have. So you see a couple pictures there. We've got some research nurseries and finishers where we do a lot of swine research. And obviously there's a lot of that goes into the commercial side of things. But what's interesting, as we have new discoveries and also perfect some of our technologies, we will utilize pieces and components of that into our show program as it's applicable to the show ring in those situations. So really something that we focus a lot on is research and development. Okay. And so that gives you a rough idea of the company, just on a high level, right? And so from here on, we're going to focus really on Ralco Show aspect in the Ralco Show brand. And I'll let Joe kind of speak to this, because Ralco has taken, as far as a parent company, has really invested in this Ralco Show brand for a number of reasons. So go ahead, Joe.
Yep. So when we talk about Ralco Show, we look at why did Ralco, with all the entities that they're invested in or areas that they're invested in, why would they invest in Ralco Show? To start out with, we look at Ralco's mission statement, and they're about leading the future and looking at the future. And so that plays perfectly into the show industry. So we think about the show industry. Those are kids, or those are individuals that are going to be leaders, hopefully one day, within the livestock industry. And so it makes perfect sense for Ralco to invest in Ralco Show. Like we said, it's investing in the future. We know that the world's demand for protein is going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to build. And we need people that are involved in agriculture, especially from a young age, to be able to go out into that workforce when they become of age and understand what it takes to grow that protein and grow those technologies to help feed the world and feed that demand. And so that plays perfectly into reinvesting into the young people of today within the show industry. One other aspect that we look at there on why they would invest, we firmly believe that those animals that we're involved with in the show industry, that it's not always about those animals that are in the show industry. It's also about the kids. And so when we think about the kids, we talk about those animals as just being tools for those kids to help grow them and mature them for the future. And like we said before, we hope that after they're done showing and their careers are over within the show industry, that they'll come back and be involved in the agriculture industry as well. And so this plays hand in hand it perfectly into why Ralco would invest in Ralco Show. One thing that we also believe in there is it helps to bring these families together. So through all the chaos that sometimes can be involved within the show industry, we can also look at it and say that hey, these families are finding a way to do this together. And in the normal life or the normal times, families can be spread apart through different ways. And so when we look at the show industry, we know that it's going to bring people together and it's going to bring families together. And it's also going to help invest them into the future of agriculture. And so by doing this ties right into Ralco Show's our mission statement that we have here, and it says, "Sure, buckles and banners are the goal, but it's the journey to the ring that drives families for their passion for show. Picking out the right projects and seeking the full potential of each animal is rewarding. At the heart of the journey to the ring is the commitment and work your projects need, and the time and energy you must give your projects to bring out their very best. Enjoy the journey. It brings families and communities together and helps build lifelong memories." At Ralco Show, we know the work is up to you, but our feeds, supplements, and advice are great tools to ensure you find the full potential in your animal. Ralco Show is here to ensure that moment before you step into the ring, as the anticipation rises, you know you've done everything to ensure lasting memories and pride in your journey to the ring. So with further ado, we'll turn this back over to Russell, and he can fall into here on how we're going to compare show pigs versus commercial pigs.
Great, thanks, Joe. That gives you some background on Ralco in general there, and I think that's really good, so that people kind of know where we're coming from and kind of the motivation of why we do that. So thanks for that, Joe. So the rest of this on this webinar, we're going to kind of look at evaluating show feeds and why show feeds are important from a kind of a high level, and we'll touch on some things as we go along here that's really going to stimulate further discussion that we'll do in the subsequent webinars. So I'll kind of talk about that a little bit and talk about how we'll follow up on some of those things. So if we really start kind of at the high level at the beginning, we really talk about show animals and show pigs specifically versus commercial pigs, right? You get different parts of the country where you're at, you'll get questions about that. Particularly you get into the Corn Belt there, a lot of pig area, and so you'll get questions of, well, why would I feed these different than I would my commercial animals, right? So we'll get some of those questions in some of those areas, and as you look at that, you basically at the high level, show pigs aren't commercial pigs, right? And so they are they're bred differently for that. What's interesting is we do have some common goals. There are some overlapping goals, and really we have to remember why we have the projects we do for the youth. Part of it's a show, part of it's also learning about food production as well, right? And that we have these market animals that we'll show, but the ultimate thing that they end up is producing a protein source for human consumption. And so you do have some overlap when it comes to that, but after that, certainly there's a lot of different goals between the two. And because of that, because there's a lot of different goals. The needs that they have are quite different. And so whether that's environment, whether that's nutrition, those types of things can all be different based upon what the goals are, particularly for show pigs versus commercial animal. And so when we talk about show pigs, now we're into an area nutritionally where we're really more targeted in our nutritional approach with those animals. So with commercial animals, you're looking at feeding groups of pigs, pens of pigs. So you're feeding barns of pigs, and very similar. You're changing diets at the same time. You're feeding them as similarly as you possibly can on a group basis. And really on a show pig, we have the luxury of really customizing that for that individual. And we can look at that individual, change their nutrition based upon what their needs are, and target at that level. And then also when we think about stress, all animals, no matter who they are, at some point they've got some stress throughout their life. Even if we talk about in pigs, you talk about weaning, right? All pigs, when they're weaned, there's some level of stress associated with weaning and that whole process. And so that's an example. And so all of them have some sort of stress there, but certainly there's different types and levels of stress with show animals. And so things we're talking about in terms of transportation, handling, heat stress, different things like that, that might be more obvious on the show side of things. And so when we look at success of those animals, really we can be successful in both. It just looks different, right? The commercial, based on the goals at the beginning versus the show ring, and certainly the show ring is going to have much different means to get at what that goal is and what that success looks like. Okay. And so from there, if we look at all the pigs in the world, if we take all the pigs and look at them, the entire population of pigs in the world, okay, not just show pigs, but commercial pigs, everything, and put those together and chart this. This would be this graph here is your normal bell-shaped curve or a normal distribution curve, and with that, let's say, for instance, we're just charting pig phenotype quality. So just quality. Quality is a word that's kind of hard to define, but let's just say we're looking at these pigs phenotypically for quality. And so you've got some variation there. There's a lot in the middle that's a really high amount of the curve, so there's a lot of average in there. Now, if we've done a really good job in terms of genetic selection and management of those pigs, of those show pigs, hopefully those show pigs end up in that top end of those of that curve, and they're really those high performers of that top end. And so because of that, they've been genetically selected for that. Potentially they have a higher genetic potential for some of these phenotypic looks that we're shooting for. Because of they may have a little different plane of nutrition to support that genetic potential. And then also when we feed these pigs, and why again we focus on show feeds, is we'll feed them for their composition of gain, so what type of tissue that they're putting on, but then also we're also paying extra attention to their appearance as well, right? So there's things such as skin and hair, and there's certainly ingredients that we can add to a diet above and beyond what we normally would to help those animals in terms of their show ring appearance and eye appeal. That's another thing that we look at for focusing in on that subpopulation of pigs that we identify. Okay. And so we talked a little about show pig stress, and so there's different areas that we can target. And so certainly when pigs are transported, there's a stress there. So if any of you are jackpotting on a week-to-week basis, sometimes some pigs will be loaded up and go to a show on Saturday and Sunday and come back home and then go the next weekend, right? And so you've got frequent transportation stress with that, loading them and hauling them and unloading them and those types of things. And then you also may be one where you just end up going to your county fair, your state fair, or some national show as well. But any of that transport is a stress on those animals. And then you add the handling part of that on top of that. So you've got handling stress with that, just in your normal handling at the show or loading for the show. But also think back to when, and maybe some of you right now having young pigs, think back to when you're starting to train those pigs. You're starting to train them to the whip, trying to train them to handle them. And all that stresses those pigs and the kids and the parents sometimes. But you're stressing those pigs a little bit until they get used to that. They get used to that handling, and then you're just exercising them the rest of the time. You're exercising them, getting ready, build up their stamina and all that. And all that involves a little bit of stress as you go through there. So that's one to handle. Now you've got contact from pigs from other environments when you go to a show. So, or when you buy pigs from different sources and bring them home and put them in the same barn. When you go to a show when these pigs are young, I always kind of joke that it's kind of like the kindergarten, that you got these all these kids with the snot nose, and you bring them all together, and they're kind of around each other, and then they go back home. And so certainly some immune stress can come from that, which can be overall immune stress or gut health and those types of things that we can touch base with on further. Environmental temperatures. Certainly this time of year, we're going to be moving into hotter temperatures in the summertime, and that can certainly be a stress on these animals. When we talk to Joe and I will do meetings some with producers or talk to kids at shows. You start talking about some of the temperature stress, and you ask these kids, what are some of the things you notice about your pig if they get hot, right? And they'll tell you things like, well, those pigs pant, or they want to go drink water, or they want to lay in the water, and those types of things, which are all correct. We certainly know pigs can't sweat, so they have a really hard time to dissipate heat, and so they find other ways to try to do that to cool themselves down. And what's interesting is the thing that pigs do often is when it's hot is they don't want to eat feed, and the reason is they don't want to eat something that makes them hotter yet. And so anyway, that we know that is certainly an impact in hot environmental temperatures that can affect that. Okay. And some of the things that we know, these stresses, we can't totally get rid of these, but we know that we can do some things nutritionally through the diet to help some of these things. So one of the common things that we see a lot is feed intake. Feed intake is a huge one. Any of these things can affect feed intake. You haul pigs to a show, you see this. When those pigs, you get there, they won't eat, right? Or you haul them home and they won't eat. And so really some things we try to do in the diet to help those pigs in terms of maintaining some consistent feed intake. Gastrointestinal health is a big one as well. Some of that comes from pigs being up and down in their feed consumption. Some of that comes from the immune stress of being around other pigs. And so anything that you can do nutritionally to help that, we know we can by how we put together feeds. And then heat stress. We also know that we can help those pigs during a hot environment by how we construct the diets together. And these are some specific things we're going to talk about next week in our next webinar, more specifically how we would construct some diets to really help address some of these issues, particularly, and again, why we focus on a show feed to feed those animals, okay? And so when we look at some keys, so this is kind of really briefly, if we look for a diet and what are some things we want to do to make sure we're successful with our show pigs. So first we want to target an appropriate gain of these animals, and a lot of that becomes buying the right age animal for what you want to show, but also identifying your target show that you're shooting for. So it's most important to try to identify where's the goal, where's the target show, and make sure you have appropriate gain to get there, okay? Muscle development, okay, go ahead. And then also proper structural development. Both those go hand in hand there because we know that if you don't feed some show animals correctly when they're young, you can actually feed them inappropriately, and it can induce some structural issues into those pigs where you have some soundness issues. You see those pigs every once in a while they get bow-legged or they get really tight and restricted in their movement, and some of that is based on how you feed those pigs early on and how they express themselves through that, okay? So animal health is another area. Well, certainly when we need to have to be in good shape to be successful, okay? Okay, you can go ahead and flip through some of those, Andy. So stress mitigation is also certainly another one that we want to address. Maximizing those pigs' genetic potential. So we know that if we've done a good job in investing in those animals, right, and you've gone out and spent some extra money on investing on those show pigs, or you've been raising pigs, so you spent the high dollar on boar semen to raise those pigs, we've selected those for better genetics, we feel, right? So we want to maximize those pigs' genetic potential. We always joke from a nutritionist standpoint, the thing a nutritionist can do is screw up a good pig, right? So we can certainly hinder a pig, right? We can't, as a nutritionist, we can't take a pig farther than what his genetics will allow, right? We can't make him better than what his genetics will allow, but we can make sure that we maximize what his genetics will allow him to be, or maximize his genetic potential and make him look the best that he can, okay? So, and then the other thing, we want to look at show ring appearance. How can we maximize our show ring appearance of those animals by feeding them appropriately? And I think there's one more there maybe. And so basically the feed is your foundation for success. To really get at all these things, it really boils down to having a really good base feed program to really help you achieve these keys that we need to, okay? And so when we evaluate show feeds, you know, there's a lot of them out there. So how do we evaluate those, and how do we know what we're looking for? Certainly we need to reference the keys to success that we're looking for, that we just went through, right? We need to remember those things. And then we need to get further in depth in terms of the details of what makes up some of these diets, okay? And one of the areas that you specifically will, a lot of people, the most information they will get on some of their diets that they buy, the feeds they buy, is basically the information they see on a feed tag. They go and buy a bag of feed and they look at the feed tag, and that's a lot of the information that they'll commonly come into contact with. The trick is that feeds are a lot more than what's just told on a feed tag, right? So if you look at this feed tag here, there's sections on this feed tag. So on the right, that's an example of a feed tag, right? So by law, there's different sections that need to be on that tag: name, purpose statement, guaranteed analysis, list of ingredients, feeding directions, and so on. Those are all, that's a standard, that's a required format that feed tags have to follow. Now, if we look more specifically at the guaranteed analysis there in the middle, there's nutrients that are on there, and those listed there are by law the ones that are required to be on a feed tag. So they have to be there, and really they have to be. For instance, crude protein has to be a minimum. It has to be minimum, where this one says not less than a certain amount. Same with lysine and fat, has to be a minimum. Fiber is actually a maximum, can't be more than. Calcium has a minimum and a maximum. Phosphorus has a minimum. Salt has a minimum and maximum, and selenium has a minimum. So those are all legal ones. Zinc's actually an extra one on here. It's not required, but those are specific ones that have to be on a feed tag. Now, thing to keep in mind is different manufacturers will treat that differently. So this diet here shows a 14% crude protein diet. Well, some manufacturers will, because they know there's some variation in ingredients and nutrient content of ingredients that can fluctuate a little bit, they'll build in some buffer there. So for instance, this diet, let's say one manufacturer may make this feed, and it may be actually a 15% or 14.5%. But they'll actually guarantee it as a 14, just to make sure that they are in the compliance with this guaranteed analysis, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is there are other manufacturers that will tag it right at expected, right at formulated levels, and so they don't build in a buffer. And so you have to keep that in mind a little bit when you evaluate that. Okay. So if we look specifically at a couple of these nutrients, one of those is crude protein, and so that's one that a lot of people will focus on, is crude protein. So if we look specifically at that on a tag, what we have to remember is pigs, even though we talk about it a lot in our feeds, we always talk about what's your protein level you feed. We know that pigs don't require a crude protein level of any kind, and although years ago that's all we talked about, over the years we've learned a lot more about protein content. And it's actually the specific amino acids that make up the protein in the diet. That's what pigs require. And so you'll notice on the tag, yeah, it has crude protein, but it also shows one specific amino acid is lysine. And so we're required to have that on there. But for pigs have 10 essential amino acids, right? And so that means that 9 of the other ones aren't listed on a tag. And so that's information that a tag doesn't tell you the full story, right? So the other thing to note is different levels of protein diets can differ in their amino acid profile, which means pigs can grow much differently on them. So as an example, you can see I said, okay, this is a 14% diet. We could have two diets that we formulate both at a 14% crude protein, and they could have much different amino acid profiles that make up that protein. So for instance, you could have one diet that has a really good amino acid profile that meets those pigs' requirements, allows those pigs to grow and meet their genetic potential and look the best they can. Then you can have another 14% that the amino acid profile is poor and it doesn't meet the pig's requirements, or they don't grow well on, they don't look good on that. And so that's something to keep in mind when you look at diets that really if you look at just crude protein, it's not really apples to apples, right? And comparing those things. The other thing we commonly talk about, and you hear people talk about, is fat level in the diet. While fat is a good energy source, it's the most nutrient dense, most energy dense nutrient ingredient that you might put into a diet. The trick is it's not completely indicative of the entire energy level of the diet. And I say that because some people say, well, I feed a 8% fat diet, so that's really high energy versus somebody's, let's say, 6% fat diet. Well, really, you can't necessarily tell that because we know there's other energy sources in the diet that contribute to energy. And also we know that how the diet is put together, how the feed is put together and formulated, actually tremendously affects the energy level. So you can have a diet that's lower in fat and actually be a pretty high energy diet based upon how it's formulated and put together. And both of these areas, this protein, this fat concept that I'm talking about, are two areas we're going to spend a fair amount of time on next week on the webinar to really get more in depth and hopefully give you some knowledge and some information about how that affects your animals, how that affects intake and growth, and how they look and those types of things. So yeah, we'll follow up on that even further. Okay. Another area that that tag doesn't tell you the whole story on is in the list of ingredients. So you see on a tag, there's a section called ingredients. You'll see that on there. Some manufacturers will use something called collective terms versus individual terms. And so by collective, that's where we're talking about grain products, plant protein products, animal protein products, processed grain products. Those are all called collective terms, which means lots of individual types of ingredients can fit under that umbrella, under that name. The opposite of that would be individual terms. So instead of using grain products, we might use corn or wheat, or we might use soybean meal or fish meal. Those would be individual. Now, legally on a tag, you can use either one. You can use collective terms and you can use individual terms. Both of those are acceptable. The thing to keep in mind for some manufacturers that use collective terms on their tags, that gives them the flexibility that they can switch out ingredients as ingredients become cheaper or more available. And so if they're least costing some of their diets, they may say, well, Milo this week is a lot cheaper than corn. Let's switch in some Milo. Or wheat mids gets cheap, and let's switch in and put in some wheat mids because I've already got that collective term on my tag. And so what that leads to is some changes periodically in diet appearance and consistency of those diets. And so I know those feeds. And so if you've ever seen some feeds sometimes where it may be dark color one time and the next color it's a little different shade, you can get some variability, but when it's an obvious change like that, sometimes that's ingredient changes. And really from a show animal and a show feed standpoint, we really want to focus in on consistency of the diet so that we don't hurt intake and we maintain some consistency in that nutrition. So something to keep in mind that a tag doesn't tell you the full story, okay? And so what are some things that a tag doesn't tell you at all? We already said that we know show feeds are much more than what a tag tells us, right? So we need to really learn a little bit more what the tag doesn't tell us that's really the full story. And so ingredient quality is one of those. How good does the manufacturer do a good job in terms of identifying good quality ingredients that they use? Because there's different grades of ingredients that are out there that can be used. Does that manufacturer focus in and invest in a good quality, okay? Palatability, certainly that's a huge one. In show animals, we got to keep them eating, got to keep them on feed consistently. So palatability is a big thing. You bring those pigs home, do they attack that feeder? Mostly, I think most people would hand feed these pigs, and that's what we suggest because you will know how much they're eating, right? If you hand feed those pigs, and you'll know on a day-to-day basis if something goes off feed. If you bring one in, you want a diet that really they'll go after. Okay. So digestibility of the diet is another one that really is affected a lot by ingredient quality. If those pigs are going to eat it, you want them to be able to digest it and get something out of it. Okay. Okay, freshness of the feed. Freshness is a big one, right? So you always hear the thing of, I went and picked up a bag of feed and it smelled old, and we found out it was from last season. You know, freshness of the diet is a key thing that certainly a tag doesn't tell you fully, and so certainly something that's important. Okay. Health components. Those are some ingredients that can be in the diet. You can't necessarily tell them off the tag potentially, but there's ingredients that are there from a nutrition standpoint, but there's also ingredients we'll use in the show feeds particularly that help with the health, particularly of those animals and their immune stress. Okay. Energy levels, we mentioned that, right? We can't tell that a lot from the tags. Be nice if we could differentiate some energy levels of those diets, but certainly something you can quiz the nutrition people on. Okay. Collective terms, we mentioned that one already. Okay. All the amino acids we mentioned in pigs have 10 essential amino acids, and we'll talk about that further next week. But lysine is the only one that's on the tag. So how are the other amino acids in the diet? Consistency of the diet is a key, right? That we want to maintain that it's the same all the time and it stays the same for the pigs. Okay. Stress relief, we already talked about the importance of stress and trying to deal with that. So there's components in a diet you can put in to help with the stress, whether it's intake, whether it's temperature stress, whether it's immune or gut health type of a stress. Okay. Enzymes. We use enzymes a lot for digestibility and improving digestibility of a diet. But what's interesting is they'll also have some health components to them as well to help gut health and overall health of those animals as well. Okay. I think mycotoxins is another one. I don't know how many of you know what mycotoxins are, but it's certainly these are byproducts of mold growth. And it doesn't necessarily have to be visible mold that's in the feed. It could have been mold that grew on the corn before it was harvested, and then there's mycotoxins in that. And so certainly want to make sure that your manufacturers do a good job in monitoring mycotoxins there. And then also from a show feed standpoint, there's some things that we can do from the diet to help those animals in terms of their support them if they happen to run into any mycotoxin issues in the diet. Okay. And then particle size. Particle size is another one that you can't tell from a feed tag, right? Until you open the bag and look at it. And even if you feed a pelleted feed, you know, pelleted feeds are ground to even a smaller particle size typically in order to make a good pellet. But certainly particle size is something that you need to look at. Okay. So those are all things that you don't see from a tag. So what are some questions that you can ask your show feed representatives out there? Basically, I put a few of them we talked about on here that we could quiz those people and ask them how are your feeds different from other companies? Basically, how are they built differently, and how do you put those together? Okay. Who formulates your show feeds? It's a good question to ask. That way, if you have access to those people, you can ask them questions. Okay. Where do your innovation and product enhancements come from? I talked about what we do in terms of doing research and development. It's certainly an important thing to always be improving. We're always doing that on the show side of things. We're always trying to get better in terms of our show animals, whether it's breeding or management or care of those animals. We're always trying to improve that. And certainly we want to do that on the feed side too, right? And supplement side to improve that. From a show feed, that's a reason why we can focus on show feed. So another one is what do you do for animal health? You can do the next one, Andy. And that one's stress. What do you do for animal stress? Both of those things what are some components in the diet that you can add that help with those? So you can ask the show feed manufacturers that. What are some things they do to really specifically address animal health and animal stress? Because we know that those show pigs, that's another reason why we feed a show feed, okay? How do pigs consume or the feed during heat stress? Or what's the feed intake during heat stress? That's a good question to ask folks because that can vary some based upon how diets are put together, is how well they stay on feed. And we certainly know that's a critical thing is to keep them on feed, okay? How are the diets, how are those feeds formulated to be easily digestible? We certainly are investing into that bag of feed. That bag of feed costs a little bit more than just your run-of-the-mill commercial feed that you might use, because of some of the extra things that we know we need to put in there for it to support that animal, to express their genetic potential. So if you're getting that, or you want that animal, once he eats it, to get as much as he can out of it, right? To be efficient in how he digests that and utilizes that feed. So those are good questions, okay? How do you ensure ingredient quality? Again, that goes back to the manufacturer and what they look at on ingredient quality, and maintain that good quality and fresh product as well, okay? And do you use any byproducts in your feed? So byproducts, a couple examples could be wheat midds or distillers dry grains with solubles, or DDGS. I don't know if you're familiar with, but DDGS is a byproduct of the ethanol industry, or co-product, you could call it. But with those, oftentimes they have some inherent inconsistencies on their own. So if anybody uses any byproducts within their feed, they can actually add to some inconsistency or some variability in the feed by using those. So that's a good question as well. Okay, so when we put all this together, and we say, okay, we have identified some keys to success. Now we look at the feed and we look at some of these components. What are some things that are absolutely critical aspects to be successful? And this starts from the beginning, once that animal consumes that feed, all the way through to resulting in the success, or how that animal performs on that diet, right? What the ultimate end result is that animal has. And so we start at the mouth, and those pigs consuming that, we really need a highly palatable diet, something they'll go to consistently. They'll go to the feeder, they'll consume that. You haul them to a show and unload them, and cross your fingers that they eat. You know, when you get there, you want to be able to bank on that. You know, and those pigs are hot. You go show them, they're hot. You got to let's say you win a class and you're got to come back later, and you think, well, you might need a little bit more fill here before we go back. You want to know that when you put it in there, he's going to eat it, right? And so all those kind of things are important, okay? Like I said, we want to promote a really good, consistent feed intake. You know, we hand feed twice a day. You don't want that to be where they eat a lot in the morning, and then at night they don't eat much, kind of thing, right? You want a good, consistent feed intake so you don't get those peaks and valleys in intake, because that has an impact on gut health. Once they consume that now that feed gets to the gut level, what are some things in that can support gut health? And we're going to talk some on that next week also in detail, about some things that you can utilize to improve gut health, not only from a microbial population in terms of the microbes that are there to support good gut health, but also just from a physical gut structure standpoint. So we talk a lot about gut barrier function, and what by gut barrier we say we want to keep things in the gut and not pass through to the animal that we want, and we want other things that we want to pass through, right? So nutrients and things, and we don't want bad bacteria passing through and getting into the bloodstream. And those are all things that are important from a gut health standpoint, because, and I'll probably jump the gun here a little bit about next week, we know that 70% of an animal, and actually a human as well, 70% of our immune system is associated with our gut tissue. Okay, 70%. So that might be a quiz question next week, maybe. So that tells us that if we can keep the gut healthy in these animals, then more than likely we're going to have better success of keeping that overall animal healthy, right? So that's why you'll hear us talk a lot about gut health in these animals, particularly in show pigs, okay? Okay, once that gets to the gut, now and again, we're following that from consumption. Now it got to the gut. Are those high quality, highly digestible ingredients in that diet so that animal can utilize those fully, right? And not be wasteful in those ingredients, okay? Once that's digested and now it's being absorbed through the gut, okay, is that have the proper nutrient profile that the animal needs to meet what that animal needs to maximize his genetic potential, okay? We talked about genetics, right? We can't take the pig farther than what he can do, but we sure want to get him up to that genetic potential where he's there. And so we got to have the proper nutrient profile to get there. And the question also is, more isn't always better on nutrients. So you may look at an age of pig and say, okay, that pig is going to require a 1% lysine diet. Well, okay, so you feed that and you think, well, 1% is good. Maybe I'll feed a 1.5% lysine diet. Well, that's not always the good, because extra on these pigs can be negative on those pigs because it's extra things that the pig has to deal with. And it's counterproductive in terms of his performance. So a pig can actually go backwards if you're pushing too hard on some of those things. Okay, once that is absorbed, now it gets into nutrients. Are those nutrients converted to the tissue that we want? Are we getting the muscle development that we want, top shape, and those types of things? Are we getting fat deposition that we want in terms of good condition of where we want that? And then we're getting good bone growth in those animals so that they have good bone strength and those types of things, okay? And then now we're looking at that feed has been absorbed. It's running through the system. Were there things in that diet that could help in terms of stress management of those pigs, whether it's heat stress, immune stress, and those types of things, okay? And then basically that gets to overall performance, okay? We factored all that in. Did that get us to an overall performance that maximized what that pig look is in terms of growth, composition of gain, and maybe the next one here too, maybe show ring appearance. I think it's maybe what the next one is there. Yeah, so show ring appearance too, right? Do we maximize that appearance from skin and hair? And we know there's ingredients that we use in diets, certainly much different than commercial animals, right? That we can maximize what their appearance is for the show ring, okay? And then I think there's one more on there, maybe. So once we get to that, now we know we've got a good base feed, that if we've used a good show feed, we cover those bases there. Now we get to a point where we get closer to show time, we can use supplementation for these targeted areas. We can tweak that animal here or there based on really specific individual needs that animal looks at. And that's something we're actually going to spend a lot of time on in the third webinar here in 2 weeks. Joe's going to spend a lot of time talking about that too, different things to look at, and actually how to apply supplements to specific animals and how differences that you might see by doing that. Okay. And those are kind of some key things there that we're looking at. And I'll kind of pass it off to Andy, and he'll kind of give us a recap, and we'll kind of go from there. If you have any questions, just remember as we go along, we've got the chat line. You can submit some questions as we go. So go ahead, Andy.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Russell and Joe. I think always a pleasure to listen to you guys talk about show pigs and some of the products and science. I know it's good to educate ourselves on some of the basics that we feel good about the knowledge we have, but it seems that there's always more to learn. So, we kind of went through, again, like Russell mentioned, the question and answer session is up there, or the chat session. Certainly feel free to send questions in. We've got a few here that we're going to go ahead and address. We got through most of the content. If you want to drop off at any time, that's fine. We'll attempt to address as many of these questions here as we can. And if you've got further questions or want to reach out to us after as well, you can certainly catch us through our Facebook page or via email at journeytothering@ralcoshow.com. We'll catch the group here. But we went through, some of the current show environment. Joe talked about how it's a good time to be learning, and always a good time to be learning, but maybe this year more than others. We got a chance to chat a little bit about Ralco and Ralco Show and why Ralco has made the investment into the show industry, looking to the future of agriculture and kids and families. Show pigs versus commercial pigs, really some good lessons there of how they're different and why we need to feed them differently. And I think some good content on genetic potential, the idea that these elite animals need to be fed accordingly to express their genetics. The idea of don't screw up a good pig, I thought was pretty good way to look at that. And then also the good show feeds are much more than the tag. The tag is what we have to evaluate feeds without having access to a show nutritionist. So, having the ability to understand those tags better is great. And then those good questions to ask, I think, are really good and ask good questions, but also I think the idea that we should be expecting good answers from those teams as well. So I think that was really good. So we're going to go ahead, grab a couple of these questions here. But before we do, just want to remind you, next week, the Science of Show Nutrition will dive into how our diets are built, how they're fundamentally different than most other diets, and how we really drive towards that top tier performance, getting the most out of the feed and getting the most feed into the animals. And then on June 4th, we'll really jump into finishing for the show ring, where we'll touch on supplementation and the role of supplements and kind of how to best use those for animals to kind of work through that and keep that moving. So don't forget to check back in. Those links will be through our Facebook page. Otherwise, the same link that you used today, if you've got the PDF invite, will get you into the to the webinar next week as well. So we'll go ahead and catch a few questions here. I know we've got a couple of them, and we're going to go ahead and hop into here. So this is a really good question. It's coming from one of our participants here. It says, how can you tell if the pig is digesting the feed well? Russell, you got some answers on that one?
Yeah, yep, that's a good question. Really, probably a big measurement from that. Okay, there's a couple things visibly, right? So you look at stool consistency of those pigs some too, right? And actually just physically look at that and see if there's undigested material on that. And that's kind of a extreme example from that. Now, if we get something that on the other end of that, say, look at performance of those animals. And so really, if you weigh those pigs on a weekly basis, or however often you weigh those pigs, if you have a scale and you do get weights on those periodically, and we're hand feeding those pigs, so we know how much they're feeding them, you should be able to really calculate how well they're converting, how well they're growing. So if I'm feeding those pigs, let's say on a smaller pig, if I'm feeding him 4 pounds, let's say I feed him 4 pounds a day, and let's say he's growing at a rate of 2 pounds, he's gonna even 1.5 pounds. You want those pigs to convert kind of in that probably 2.3 to 3.0 pounds of feed per pound of gain, just to give you a rough idea right in there. And so that feed conversion actually goes from a low number when they're young to a higher number when they're get older. So let's say I've got a 100-pound pig. That pig's probably going to convert at about a 2 to 2.2 pounds of feed per 1 pound of gain, just to give you a rough idea. Now you get to a pig that's about 280. Those are probably going to be 3 or a little bit more, 3 pounds of feed to 1 pound of gain. And that gives you a little bit of a rough idea, right? That gives you an idea of how well those pigs are converting. Because certainly if you're spending money on that feed, you don't want to be adding that feed and then, add 50 pounds and you're only getting 50 pounds of gain out of that feed, out of that 50 pounds, right? So how that diet's put together can have an impact on that. So yeah, good question there.
That's a good question. And Russell, I think that's another good point of just reinforcing the hand feeding too, so you know what kind of consumption you're getting, so you can check back on that versus the feeder. Got another question here, talking about mycotoxins and just asking about, is that common for show feeds to be addressing mycotoxins within the feed? They found some interest in that dialogue there that you had.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So, there's all different kinds of mycotoxins, and we could probably do a whole webinar. No, actually, I have done whole webinars on mycotoxins before. There's different kinds of ones. Some of them you guys might hear before, like aflatoxin is a specific kind of mycotoxin. There's different ones, the vomitoxin or zearalenone. And so those come from different molds. But basically, you can get that from your grain most commonly. And so if you happen to get, when they put store grain in a bin, in big bins, they won't always have, not all that would have it uniformly. They might end up with a wet spot or something in there, and you get a hot spot and you don't realize it. And so sometimes you could get some of that in a feed not knowing. But actually, we've done a lot of research in that area, and we actually put some things in the diet that actually helps animals deal with that stress if they happen to come in there. So we put it in all the diets all the time, just as an insurance policy, and it's in all of our show feed. And that's a good recommendation to do across the board. We actually do it in our sow feeds also as a good insurance, so that if they happen to come into contact with that, they can. But ideally, we don't have that be an issue, right? If we do a good job with ingredient quality and those types of things. So good question.
That is a good question. Another question talking about, you mentioned heat stress there a couple of times during the presentation. And the question was, how can diets help keep that consumption up during heat stress?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we'll go in certainly into more in depth and next week in this, because I think that's a really it's a really cool topic. If you understand kind of the basics of some of these feeds, next week I really encourage you to get on there because it's a really fun one to talk through some of the science behind that and how that's put together. And one of those is how we feed those pigs during heat stress, or how the diets we put together affects their intake during heat stress, and how do you keep them on the feed. So when it gets 100 degrees outside, you can't totally eliminate the heat stress on those animals, but if you can help those pigs feel better, where in the diet doesn't contributes a lot of heat to them, they'll actually eat better. So we actually will formulate diets and look at how much heat that diet generates internally in those animals. And so we will value a formulation that makes what we would call a cooler diet that doesn't contribute a lot of heat load to those animals. And so because of that, they'll continue to eat it when it's hot out and continue to grow. And so I encourage you next week to get on there because we'll go into in depth on that. It's pretty cool to see how that works.
Awesome. We'll kind of keep rolling through. We got a good list of questions. We appreciate all of our attendees. A great turnout tonight. We appreciate you sending in the questions. So got another one just talking about feed composition and minimizing the potential for ulcers or stress leading to ulcers. Is there anything we got to talk to about that there, Russell?
Yeah, a big thing in terms of ulcers is consistency of feed intake. That's a big thing. So if you get a lot of up and down intake where they eat a lot and then they don't eat a lot, that is a trigger for increasing your risk for ulcer issues in pigs. And so that's another reason why we talk about maintaining a focus on consistent feed intake. Another one you can get into is particle size, actually, a feed that can increase risk. If you get to really too fine of a particle size, that is actually a risk factor that you get can increase a little bit of an ulcer challenge. And in fact, you actually have some genetic components. They found that there are some genetic components to risks of ulcers. But honestly, one of the key things that helps that as much as anything is consistent feed intake, having a little bit of fiber source in that diet. And by that, we talk about some specific soluble fibers, and we'll talk about some of that actually next week too, about some specific soluble fibers that helps that gut, that can be helpful in terms of an ulcer type of a challenge. So yeah, those are some things that you can do nutritionally from an ulcer standpoint.
Another one kind of overlaps one a little bit earlier, but it's just, what symptoms can you be looking for that you're having challenges with your nutrition? Maybe ties in a little bit with your that earlier question regarding digestibility, but what symptoms can people be looking for that may be a sign of their nutrition's letting them down a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So probably lots of things, right? You have an expectation of what those animals look like, right? And we're trying to feed those animals to a certain target show. So we identify that target gain we want to get. So are we getting that target gain that we're looking for, and that what we're feeding them, we should be getting that gain? The other one would be the look, right, and the appearance of those animals. We have an idea of what we think those animals need to look like, and again, we pick out pigs at a young age and trying to project them right to what they look like, and hopefully we do a better job all the time of learning how to do that and project those animals. But you have a good idea. If you look at some of the genetics behind them, you'll have a good idea of maybe what they ought to look like. And if the feed's not getting them there like you think it is, like it should, certainly something you can look at there. And then intake is another thing. We see a lot of issues with the intake just from people asking questions that are feeding other feeds or whatever, and they have up and down intakes and questions like that. And then just overall look, like I said, are they getting that look and that condition on those animals that they're looking for? And then the big one also is gut health. Is that feed actually delivering the tools that you need to maximize gut health of those animals? So are you having any issues with that? Those are all good things to look at. So probably certainly more than one thing to look at there from that, but those are all indicators that you look at. So.
We'll get through a fair amount of the feed questions. If there's any more and folks want to send them in, you sure can. We got couple more questions here I want to address. We got someone's just asking, hopping ahead to the supplements a little bit, but asking about what 2 feed supplements you feel needed to be at daily to achieve a show ring appearance. What are your 2 favorite supplements there?
That's a Joe question there.
There you go.
Yep. So 2 supplements that we would add daily in there to achieve show ring. Say that question again, Andy.
They're asking about the two favorite, let me see if I can find it again. What are your top two feed supplements that you feel need to be added daily to achieve show ring appearance?
Yep. So one for me would be the appetite attack. That's a supplement that I would put in there daily. That falls back into that's the talk that Russell just gave there about consistency of consumption, ensuring that the gut stays healthy with those animals. That product's going to help ensure that. So that's going to help buffer that gut, keep that gut functioning in the proper manner, and keep those pigs on feed and consuming at a consistent rate there. The other one for me would probably be the On Point product, which would be an egg-based product that we have there. And that's one that's going to help to improve muscle shape and freshness on the top side of those animal skeletons as far as a muscle shape and muscle composition look. And then also from a skin and hair presence, it's going to help with that as well. And so those would be my two go-to supplements that I would add there into feed to ensure those goals that you're looking for there.
Great question. Another question kind of tying back to mycotoxins, and they must have a little awareness of our commercial products. It's asking if IntegraFlow is in the show feeds or just ingredients that help fight or balance the mycotoxins. So.
Yep. Good question. IntegraFlow is a mycotoxin support product that we have, and we sell it as its own ingredient, but it is in all of our show feed. We put it in all the show feed. It's a good insurance to have there in case those pigs do come into contact with toxins there, and can support those during that time period. So, yep, good question. It's in there.
Great question. It looks like we've got kind of got through the questions. So again, we appreciate everybody taking the time to join us. Don't forget next week to tune in for a little bit deeper dive into the nutrition side of things. Again, the same link that you used tonight will work. Certainly reach out to your friends in your network and let them know that if you enjoyed the presentation tonight, to join us the next couple dates, next 2 weeks on Thursdays at 7:30 for a little deeper dive into both how we build our nutritional diets. We'll talk a little bit about diet, the way they're manufactured, the way they're built, and then also on utilization of those diets a little bit next week, and then the supplementation as well the week following. I did get one last question here I want to get in before we go. Certainly we know we're at about our time, so if you'd like to hop off, you certainly can. But the question here is, do feed tags say when the feed was made or have a best by date so a consumer will know if they're getting the freshest feed available?
Yep. Yes. It depends on where those feeds are manufactured. So, depending on what show feed that you're using, generally the program, they'll use lot numbers on those from a traceability standpoint, and that's more from a quality control standpoint. If there's an issue, they can trace that type of stuff down and those types of things. But and because of that, oftentimes it may be just a lot number. Sometimes it'll have a date on it, but sometimes it may just be a sort of a coded lot number that you don't necessarily know. But if you ask the manufacturer, they can tell you some of those days. So you get different ones of those out in the industry. With our stuff, and Joe can chime in with this too. How we manufacture some of our feeds regionally in different areas, so that specifically we try to manufacture it closer to geographic areas to help with distribution and also freshness of those feeds and that type of thing. And so because of that, we have several manufacturers across the country that do that. And so those may be a little different. I don't know if Joe, you had any more to add on that, or that was good.
Nope. You're exactly right. It all depends on the mill or the location that those products are coming from, and how their coding and system works depends completely on where those are going to be at and how you can tell from one to the other. I would say that if you've got those questions, find out where your feed's coming from, get with the mill and find out what their system looks like and how you can tell those dates. And I would try to be extremely thorough as you can with that, as far as going through their system and trying to figure those things out, so you can ensure that you're getting the freshest, highest quality products that you can.
All right. Well, thank you. We look forward to seeing you all next week. Check out our Facebook page for updates on webinar and other content. Make sure you like and share that out there. We'll have those events are posted. Next week's event should be posted on Facebook now. So if you go out and want to go ahead and show that you're interested in that or share it from Facebook, next week's webinar is now available out there. And check out our webinars for more. We'll be talking to you in the next couple of weeks. So thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you, guys.
We'll see you.